Welcome, dear listeners, to Pleasantville Estates, a place where the lawns are green, the houses are a uniform beige, and the smiles are, well, let's just say they're carefully curated. Imagine a perfectly manicured postcard come to life, where every blade of grass is precisely the same height, every shrub is artfully sculpted, and every resident adheres, with unnerving precision, to the HOA's meticulously crafted rulebook. It's the kind of place where you can set your watch to the synchronized sprinkler systems, where the only drama comes from choosing the right shade of petunia, and where conformity is not just encouraged, it's practically enforced at gunpoint. Metaphorically speaking, of course. They frown on firearms in Pleasantville Estates. But beneath this veneer of suburban bliss, tensions simmer, resentments fester like weeds in a neglected flower bed. And at the heart of it all stands Karen. Not just any Karen, mind you, but the Karen, the undisputed champion of neighborhood watch notifications, the queen of passive-aggressive potlucks, and the reigning monarch of meticulously maintained lawns. Her front yard isn't just a lawn, it's a masterpiece. A verdant tapestry of perfectly aligned fescue, artfully arranged flower beds bursting with vibrant color, and a sprinkler system so sophisticated it could probably solve quadratic equations. It's her pride, her joy, her reason for being, and her weapon of choice in the ongoing battle for suburban supremacy. But now, a dark cloud looms over Pleasantville Estates, threatening to shatter its pristine facade. Water restrictions. Stage 1 had been annoying, Stage 2, inconvenient. But now, Stage 3, with its mandatory brown patches and restricted sprinkler schedules, is a declaration of war. For Karen, it's a personal affront. Her roses, her prize-winning hybrid tea roses, are already showing signs of distress. Their velvety petals are drooping, their vibrant hues fading, and their stems are starting to resemble, well, let's just say they're not looking their best. As the sun beats down on Pleasantville Estates, baking the perfectly uniform lawns to a crispy brown, Karen's resentment begins to boil. The HOA, with their smug pronouncements and their draconian regulations, have crossed a line. They've threatened her roses, and in doing so, they've awakened a beast within. A beast fueled by fertilizer, righteous indignation, and an unwavering belief in her own superiority. Little does Pleasantville Estates know, the storm that's brewing isn't just a summer thunderstorm, it's a Karen-fueled hurricane, and it's about to make landfall with devastating consequences. The theft of a fire truck is just the beginning. The monthly HOA meeting was, as always, a masterclass in passive aggression and thinly veiled power plays. Held in the sterile, beige-walled community center, it was a gathering of Pleasantville Estates' most dedicated rule followers and aspiring dictators. The air hung heavy with the scent of stale coffee and unspoken grievances. Board President Mildred McMillan, a woman whose hairstyle hadn't changed since the Eisenhower administration, stood at the podium, a grim expression etched on her face. Mildred ruled the HOA with an iron fist, wielding the rulebook like a holy text and striking fear into the hearts of even the most seasoned suburbanites. Her pronouncements were delivered with the gravitas of a Supreme Court justice, and her gavel strikes echoed through the room like thunderclaps. "Good evening, residents," Mildred began, her voice amplified by the cheap microphone. "As you are all aware, the drought situation has worsened considerably. Despite our best efforts to conserve water, the reservoir levels continue to decline. Therefore, the board has made the difficult, but necessary, decision to implement Stage 4 water restrictions, effective immediately." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Stage 4.it was the stuff of Pleasantville Estates nightmares. It meant no more lawn watering, no more car washes, and no more filling the inflatable kiddie pools that dotted the neighborhood like blue oases. It meant brown lawns, dusty cars, and disappointed children. But for Karen, it meant something far more devastating: the slow, agonizing death of her roses. Mildred continued, oblivious to the silent horror she had unleashed. Under Stage 4, all outdoor water usage is strictly prohibited. Violators will be subject to fines, escalating to potential suspension of HOA privileges. We understand this is a difficult adjustment, but we must all do our part to ensure the sustainability of our community. The room remained silent, save for the occasional cough or nervous fidget. Everyone knew that challenging Mildred was a fool's errand. She had a network of informants, a team of dedicated rule enforcers, and a seemingly endless supply of spite. But Karen was not like everyone else. As Mildred droned on about water conservation tips and alternative landscaping options, suggestions that Karen dismissed as utter heresy, Karen's fury reached a boiling point. Her knuckles turned white as she gripped the armrests of her plastic chair. Her eyes narrowed, focusing on Mildred with laser-like intensity. The simmering resentment that had been building for weeks finally erupted. In that moment, Karen made a decision. She wouldn't stand idly by while her roses withered and died. She wouldn't succumb to the tyranny of the HOA and their ridiculous water restrictions. She would fight back. She would water her roses, come hell or high water, or, as it would turn out, a stolen fire truck. The battle lines had been drawn. Pleasantville Estates was about to become a war zone. The first attempt was rainwater harvesting. Karen, armed with a collection of industrial-sized trash cans and a network of strategically placed tarpaulins, transformed her backyard into a makeshift reservoir. It was a sight to behold, a post-apocalyptic landscape of plastic and desperation. The neighbors, initially amused, quickly grew concerned as the contraption began to resemble a biohazard containment unit. The HOA, of course, issued a cease and desist order citing aesthetic violations and potential mosquito breeding grounds. Karen argued, citing her constitutional right to collect rainwater, a right she may or may not have invented, but Mildred McMillan was unmoved. The rainwater harvesting operation was shut down within 48 hours. Next came the bribery attempt. Karen, never one to shy away from a little under-the-table negotiation, targeted the meter reader, a young man named Kevin with a penchant for Hawaiian shirts and a crippling student loan debt. She offered him a generous sum of cash in exchange for misreading her water meter. Kevin, tempted by the prospect of financial freedom, almost agreed. But then he remembered Mildred McMillan's network of informants and her reputation for ruthless retribution. He politely declined, citing his unwavering commitment to ethical meter reading practices and a healthy fear of Mildred. Desperate, Karen turned to her neighbor, Bob, a retired accountant with a meticulously manicured lawn of his own. Bob, however, was a staunch supporter of the HOA and a firm believer in water conservation. Karen attempted to appeal to his sense of community, his love of roses, and his inherent human decency. She even offered to share her secret fertilizer recipe, a closely guarded family heirloom passed down through generations of competitive gardeners. But Bob remained steadfast. He lectured Karen on the importance of responsible water usage and suggested she consider replacing her roses with drought-resistant succulents. Each failed attempt fueled Karen's determination. She wouldn't be defeated by water restrictions, nosy neighbors, or a power-hungry HOA president. She would find a way to water her roses, even if it meant resorting to increasingly outlandish and morally questionable tactics. The idea of the fire truck, at this point, was still a distant, flickering ember in the back of her mind. But the failures were the kindling, and Mildred McMillan was about to inadvertently provide the spark, because the HOA, not content with simply enforcing the water restrictions, decided to hold a mandatory water conservation workshop, led by none other than Mildred McMillan herself. The workshop, held in the same sterile community center where the stage for announcement had been made, was a 2-hour lecture on the virtues of xeriscaping, the evils of overwatering, and the importance of sacrificing personal desires for the greater good of the community. It was, in Karen's opinion, a form of psychological torture. And it was the final straw. As Mildred droned on about the benefits of gravel gardens, Karen's eyes glazed over. The ember in her mind ignited. The fire truck idea took hold. It was crazy, it was reckless, it was probably illegal, but it was also her only hope. Let's be clear. Stealing a fire truck is not a rational act. It's the kind of idea that bubbles up from the depths of sleep-deprived desperation, marinated in equal parts righteous indignation and utter disregard for the law. It's the kind of plan that sounds brilliant at 3 a.m., but utterly insane in the cold light of day. And yet, for Karen, it was the only logical solution. From an outside perspective, of course, the flaws were glaring. Karen had absolutely no experience driving a fire truck. She barely knew how to operate her own SUV, often mistaking the windshield wiper fluid for the turn signal. She had no idea where the town even kept the reserve fire truck. And even if she managed to steal it, she had no guarantee she could actually operate the hose. But Karen wasn't thinking logically. She was operating on pure, unadulterated Karen logic, a potent blend of entitlement, stubbornness, and a complete lack of self-awareness. In her mind, the fire truck was simply a means to an end, a giant, mobile watering can capable of delivering gallons of life-saving water to her thirsty roses. The fact that it was a government vehicle, designed for emergencies, and protected by layers of security was a mere inconvenience. The sheer absurdity of the plan was almost comical. Imagine Karen, a suburban housewife in sensible shoes and a floral print dress, attempting to commandeer a multi-ton fire engine. Picture her struggling to navigate the complex controls, wrestling with the oversized steering wheel, and accidentally activating the siren at 3 a.m., waking up the entire neighborhood. It was a recipe for disaster. A comedic train wreck waiting to happen. Even ChatGPT, when consulted, hypothetically, of course, would likely have advised against the plan. Stealing a fire truck carries significant legal risks, the AI would have cautioned. Consider alternative solutions, such as negotiating with the HOA, exploring drought-resistant landscaping, or simply accepting the inevitable decline of your roses. But Karen wasn't interested in rational advice. She was on a mission. She was a woman possessed. She was the floral print-clad embodiment of suburban rebellion, and she was about to embark on the most audacious, ill-conceived, and hilarious adventure of her life. The fire truck didn't stand a chance. Neither did Pleasantville Estates. The gears were turning, the plan was forming, and Karen was ready to unleash her inner pyromaniac, figuratively speaking, of course. She only wanted the water. The Pleasantville Estates Volunteer Fire Station, a quaint, single-story building on the outskirts of town, was not exactly Fort Knox. It was more like a slightly overgrown shed with a big red door and a sign that read, "Volunteers needed. Apply within." Pizza provided. The security measures consisted of a rusty chain-link fence, a perpetually malfunctioning motion sensor light, and a sleepy golden retriever named Sparky who mostly slept on the porch, the reserve fire truck. A vintage model from the 1970s affectionately known as Big Red was parked inside. Big Red was not exactly state-of-the-art. Its paint was chipped, its tires were bald, and its engine coughed and sputtered like a chain smoker. But it was a fire truck, nonetheless, and it held the key to Karen's floral salvation. Karen's reconnaissance mission took place under the cover of darkness, dressed in a camouflage tracksuit purchased online after a frantic Google search for stealth clothing. She crept through the overgrown weeds surrounding the fire station, dodging discarded pizza boxes and dodging Sparky, who, thankfully, remained sound asleep. She peered through the grimy windows, surveying the interior. The keys were hanging on a hook near the entrance. The ignition looked surprisingly simple. This might actually work. The heist itself was a masterclass in amateur criminality. Karen, armed with a pair of bolt cutters, borrowed from Bob, her unsuspecting neighbor, easily breached the chain-link fence. She tiptoed past Sparky, who, despite his reputation as a guard dog, merely wagged his tail and rolled over for a belly rub. She jimmied the lock on the fire station door with a bobby pin, a skill she had learned from a true crime documentary, and slipped inside. The interior of the fire station smelled of stale coffee, motor oil, and desperation. Karen found the keys, her heart pounding in her chest. She climbed into the driver's seat of Big Red, feeling a surge of adrenaline. The controls were intimidatingly complex, a confusing array of buttons, levers, and gauges. But Karen was undeterred. She inserted the key, turned the ignition, and held her breath. Big Red coughed, sputtered, and then roared to life. Shaking the fire station to its foundations, the siren blared, shattering the peaceful silence of the night. Sparky, finally awakened from his slumber, began to bark hysterically. Karen panicked. She slammed the gearshift into drive and lurched forward, crashing through the fire station door and into the street. The heist was underway. Pleasantville Estates would never be the same. With the siren wailing and the engine roaring, Karen careened down the streets of Pleasantville Estates, leaving a trail of bewildered neighbors and startled squirrels in her wake. Big Red, despite its age and dilapidated condition, was a powerful machine, and Karen, with her limited driving skills and complete lack of fire truck expertise, was barely in control. She swerved erratically, narrowly avoiding parked cars, mailboxes, and the occasional bewildered pedestrian. She fumbled with the gearshift, accidentally shifting into reverse and sending Big Red hurtling backwards towards a meticulously manicured hedge, belonging, of course, to Mildred McMillan. She slammed on the brakes just in time, narrowly averting a horticultural disaster. The neighbors, initially shocked by the unexpected noise and commotion, began to emerge from their homes, clutching their robes and peering into the darkness. They watched in disbelief as Big Red, driven by a figure they vaguely recognized as Karen, careened down the street like a runaway train. Some whispered in disbelief, others chuckled in amusement, and a few, the more astute observers, sensed that something truly extraordinary was unfolding. Reaching her own house, Karen wrestled Big Red to a stop in front of her lawn. The roses, illuminated by the truck's headlights, seemed to sigh with relief. Now came the tricky part: operating the hose. Karen had watched enough movies to have a general idea of how it worked, but the reality was far more complicated. She located the hose reel, a massive contraption of metal and rubber, and began to crank the handle. The hose slowly unwound, a thick, unwieldy serpent that threatened to topple her over. She struggled to detach the nozzle, a heavy brass fitting that seemed determined to remain firmly attached. After several minutes of grunting and straining, she finally managed to wrestle it free. Now, how to turn on the water? Karen scanned the control panel, a bewildering array of valves, switches, and dials. She randomly flipped a switch labeled auxiliary pump, and the engine coughed and sputtered, threatening to stall. She quickly flipped it back off. She tried another switch, labeled deck gun, and a jet of water shot skyward, drenching the roof of her house. She yelped in surprise and quickly shut it off. Finally, after much trial and error, she located the main water valve. She turned it slowly, cautiously, and a torrent of water erupted from the hose, blasting her backwards into a flower bed. She scrambled to her feet, grabbed the nozzle, and aimed it towards her roses. The moment of truth had arrived. Please provide a brief summary in English, 1 to 2 sentences, of the following text. Standing triumphant amidst the petunias, soaked but undeterred, Karen finally had the upper hand. She gripped the fire hose nozzle like a weapon, a tool of liberation, and unleashed a torrent of water upon her parched lawn. The roses, previously drooping and despondent, perked up instantly, their velvety petals drinking in the life-giving moisture. Karen reveled in the excess. She sprayed the lawn with reckless abandon, creating miniature geysers and shimmering rainbows. She hosed down the flower beds, the shrubs, and even the sidewalk, washing away the dust and grime of Pleasantville estates. That it was a cleansing, a rebellion, a declaration of independence from the tyranny of the HOA. The neighbors, now fully awake and gathered on their lawns, watched the spectacle unfold with a mixture of shock, awe, and concern. Some shook their heads in disapproval, muttering about water wastage and the inevitable consequences. Others cheered her on, secretly envious of her audacity and her perfectly watered lawn. And a few, the truly adventurous ones, even grabbed their own garden hoses and joined in the watery revelry, creating a spontaneous, albeit illegal, neighborhood water fight. Bob, the retired accountant, stood on his lawn, his face a mask of disapproval. He clutched his chest, as if witnessing a heart attack. Mildred McMillan, alerted to the commotion by her network of informants, arrived on the scene. Her face contorted with rage, she pointed a trembling finger at Karen, shouting accusations of theft, vandalism, and general suburban anarchy. But Karen was beyond reproach. She was in her element, a floral print warrior fighting for her right to a green lawn. She ignored Mildred's tirade, focusing instead on her roses, ensuring that each and every one received its fair share of water. However, the sheer power of the fire hose was proving difficult to manage. The pressure was immense, and the hose snaked and twisted like a living thing, threatening to pull Karen off her feet. She struggled to maintain control, bracing herself against the force of the water. And that's when it happened that a sudden surge of pressure sent the hose whipping wildly out of control. Karen lost her grip, and the nozzle spun around, spraying water in all directions. The force of the water propelled her backwards, sending her tumbling head over heels across her lawn. Big Red, suddenly unmanned, began to roll forward, its engine still roaring, its sirens still blaring, its hose still spraying. Water in a chaotic arc disaster was imminent. Tumbling across her lawn, Karen watched in horror as Big Red, now a rogue, water-spewing behemoth, lumbered down the street. The truck was gaining speed, its engine roaring, its siren blaring, its hose whipping back and forth like a possessed tentacle. The neighbors scattered, diving for cover behind bushes, cars, and strategically placed garden gnomes. Mildred McMillan, momentarily stunned by the chaos, regained her composure and shrieked, "Stop that truck! Someone, stop that truck!" But no one dared to approach the runaway fire engine. Big Red was a force of nature, an unstoppable symbol of suburban rebellion. The truck swerved erratically, narrowly missing a group of teenagers skateboarding down the street. It plowed through a row of garbage cans, scattering trash and debris in its wake. It clipped a parked minivan, setting off its alarm. The scene resembled a low-budget disaster movie, with Big Red playing the role of the rampaging monster. Karen, finally regaining her footing, sprinted after the truck, desperately trying to catch up. She waved her arms frantically, shouting, "Big Red, stop, come back." But Big Red was deaf to her pleas. The truck had a mind of its own, and it was determined to wreak havoc on Pleasantville Estates. As Big Red careened down the street, its path became increasingly clear. It was heading straight for the HOA office, a drab, one-story building located at the end of the cul-de-sac. The HOA office, the epicenter of Pleasantville Estates regulatory control, the symbol of everything Karen detested. It was a target too perfect to be accidental. Inside the HOA office, the board meeting was in full swing. Mildred McMillan, having returned from her failed attempt to subdue Karen, was holding court, lecturing the board members on the importance of maintaining community standards. Bob, the retired accountant, was droning on about budget allocations, and the other board members, a collection of bored and disgruntled suburbanites, were struggling to stay awake. Suddenly, the ground began to tremble, the windows rattled, the lights flickered. The board members looked up in alarm. "What's going on?" Mildred demanded, her voice laced with suspicion. Before anyone could answer, the wall of the HOA office exploded inward, sending debris flying in all directions. A torrent of water flooded the room, drenching the board members and sending them scrambling for safety. Big Red had arrived. The scene inside the HOA office was one of utter pandemonium. Board members, soaked to the bone and covered in debris, scrambled to their feet, sputtering and coughing. Mildred McMillan, her perfectly coiffed hair, now plastered to her head, stood in the middle of the room, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. The room was flooded with ankle-deep water, swirling with shredded documents, overturned furniture, and the occasional rogue garden gnome. Important HOA records, meticulously organized and carefully preserved, floated on the surface, transforming into soggy, illegible pulp. The air was thick with the smell of wet paper, motor oil, and the faint scent of roses. Big Red, having completed its mission of destruction, sat half embedded in the wall of the HOA office, its engine sputtering and its siren still blaring. The hose, still spewing water, continued to wreak havoc, drenching anything that remained dry. Karen, having finally reached the scene, stood on the lawn outside the HOA office, staring in stunned disbelief at the carnage. She couldn't believe what had happened. She had only wanted to water her roses. How had things escalated so quickly? The neighbors, drawn by the noise and the spectacle, gathered around the HOA office, gawking at the scene. Some laughed openly, others gasped in horror, and a few surreptitiously snapped photos with their cell phones. The HOA office crash was the most exciting thing to happen in Pleasantville Estates in decades. As the initial shock wore off, the board members began to assess the damage. Bob, the retired accountant, waded through the water, frantically trying to salvage the budget spreadsheets. Mildred McMillan, her voice dripping with venom, pointed a trembling finger at Karen and declared, "You will pay for this, Karen. You will pay dearly." The police, alerted to the situation by multiple 911 calls, arrived on the scene, sirens wailing and lights flashing. They cautiously approached Big Red, their hands hovering over their holsters. The era of Karen's reign of terror was coming to an end. The flashing lights of the police cars illuminated the scene, casting long shadows across the flooded lawn and the half-demolished HOA office. The officers, initially bewildered by the sight before them, quickly regained their composure and began to assess the situation. Karen, still in her floral print dress and soaked to the bone, was quickly apprehended. She offered little resistance, her initial shock having given way to a strange sense of resignation. As she was led away in handcuffs, she glanced back at her roses, now glistening with moisture, and a faint smile crossed her lips. Inside the HOA office, the board members, still dripping and furious, huddled together, plotting their revenge. Mildred McMillan, her voice trembling with rage, declared, "This is an act of war, and we will respond accordingly. We will make sure that Karen pays for her crimes. We will make her life a living hell." Bob, the retired accountant, nodded in agreement, his eyes gleaming with righteous indignation. "We will pursue the maximum penalties under the law," he said. "We will sue her for every penny she has. We will make an example of her, so that no one else ever dares to defy the authority of the HOA. The other board members chimed in. offering their own suggestions for Karen's punishment: increased HOA fees, mandatory community service, and permanent banishment from Pleasantville estates. The mood was one of righteous fury, fueled by humiliation, wet clothes, and the destruction of their carefully curated world. As Karen was placed in the back of the police car, she overheard Mildred's threats and the board's vows of revenge. She knew that she was in serious trouble, but she couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. She had stood up to the HOA, she had watered her roses, and she had brought a moment of chaos and excitement to the otherwise mundane lives of Pleasantville Estates residents. The police car pulled away, leaving behind a scene of devastation and recrimination. The HOA office was a wreck, the lawn was a swamp, and the board members were plotting their revenge. But Karen had achieved her goal. Her roses were watered, and Pleasantville Estates would never be the same. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. Karen's story, with its bizarre blend of suburban angst, floral obsession, and grand theft auto, was irresistible to the media. It quickly went viral, spreading across the internet like wildfire and capturing the attention of news outlets around the world. Suburban housewife steals fire truck to water roses, the headline screamed. Karen versus the HOA, a battle for the ages. The trial became a national spectacle, a circus of absurdity and legal maneuvering. The courtroom was packed with reporters, curious onlookers, and supporters of both Karen and the HOA. The proceedings were broadcast live on television, attracting millions of viewers eager to witness the latest chapter in the Karen saga. Much to the dismay of her court-appointed lawyer, who quickly resigned, citing irreconcilable differences, Karen decided to represent herself. She believed that she was the only one who could truly understand the motivations behind her actions and articulate her defense. Her opening statement was a rambling, incoherent monologue about the importance of roses, the tyranny of the HOA, and her constitutional right to a green lawn. She cited obscure legal precedents, misquoted famous philosophers, and made several impassioned pleas to the jury's sense of humanity. As the trial progressed, Karen's defenses became increasingly bizarre and self-incriminating. She argued that the fire truck was a weapon of mass irrigation, that the HOA office was a threat to national security, and that her roses were essential to the survival of the human race. She called witnesses who testified to her unwavering dedication to her lawn, her encyclopedic knowledge of horticulture, and her unwavering belief in her own righteousness. She presented evidence in the form of photographs of her roses, soil samples from her garden, and a detailed diagram of her sprinkler system. The prosecution, led by a seasoned attorney named Mr. Stern, had a relatively easy time dismantling Karen's defenses. He presented evidence of the stolen fire truck, the damaged HOA office, and the numerous laws that Karen had broken. He called witnesses who testified to Karen's erratic behavior, her disregard for authority, and her general tendency to cause trouble. Despite the overwhelming evidence against her, Karen remained defiant. She believed that she was fighting for a just cause, and she refused to back down. In her closing argument, she delivered a passionate plea to the jury, urging them to see her as a victim of circumstance, a defender of beauty, and a champion of freedom. The jury deliberated for several days, struggling to reconcile the evidence with their own sense of justice. The fate of Karen and the future of Pleasantville Estates hung in the balance. Back in Pleasantville Estates, the community was divided. Karen's actions had sparked a range of reactions, revealing the underlying tensions and simmering resentments that had always existed beneath the veneer of suburban conformity. Some residents, particularly those who had always adhered strictly to the HOA's rules, were horrified by Karen's actions. They saw her as a criminal, a vandal, and a threat to the stability of their community. They supported the HOA's efforts to punish her to the fullest extent of the law. They whispered about her behind her back, shook their heads in disapproval, and made sure to keep their distance. Others, however, were secretly amused by Karen's rebellion. They had always chafed under the HOA's strict regulations, and they saw Karen as a symbol of resistance, a lone warrior fighting against the forces of conformity. They chuckled at the image of Mildred McMillan soaked to the bone, and they secretly admired Karen's audacity. They offered her words of encouragement, left anonymous gifts on her doorstep, and secretly watered their lawns in defiance of the water restrictions. And then there were those who saw Karen as a folk hero, a modern-day Robin Hood fighting for the common good. They believed that the HOA had gone too far, that the water restrictions were unfair, and that Karen was simply standing up for what she believed in. They organized rallies in her support, wrote letters to the editor, and even started a Free Karen campaign. They saw her as a martyr, a victim of a tyrannical system, and they were determined to see her vindicated. Bob, the retired accountant, found himself ostracized by some of his neighbors for his unwavering support of the HOA. He was accused of being a company man, a rule follower, and a tool of the establishment. He tried to defend his position, arguing that rules were necessary to maintain order and that Karen's actions were reckless and irresponsible. But his arguments fell on deaf ears. Mildred McMillan, on the other hand, found herself the target of ridicule and scorn. She was portrayed in the media as a power-hungry tyrant, a heartless bureaucrat, and a symbol of everything that was wrong with suburban America. She received hate mail, threatening phone calls, and even a few anonymous packages containing bags of fertilizer. The community of Pleasantville Estates was fractured, divided by Karen's actions and the ensuing fallout. The once harmonious neighborhood had become a battleground, a place of suspicion, resentment, and simmering conflict. The Karen saga had exposed the fault lines that had always existed beneath the surface, and the community would never be the same. The HOA, fueled by Mildred McMillan's unwavering vendetta, was not content to simply let the legal system handle Karen. They saw her as an existential threat, a symbol of anarchy that needed to be crushed, and so they embarked on a campaign of petty tyranny, instituting a series of increasingly absurd and restrictive regulations that seemed designed to target Karen specifically, even while she was awaiting trial and later, presumably, incarcerated. The first new regulation was the Floral Aesthetic Compliance Act, which mandated that all residents replace their roses with drought-resistant succulents. This was a direct attack on Karen's beloved roses, a symbolic act of dominance by the HOA. Residents were given a strict deadline to comply, and those who failed to do so were threatened with hefty fines and potential eviction. Next came the Noise Ordinance Enhancement, which prohibited any noise above a whisper between the hours of 8 p.m. and 8 a.m. This was clearly aimed at preventing any further, unauthorized use of fire truck sirens. The ordinance was enforced with extreme rigor, with HOA patrols prowling the streets at night, armed with decibel meters and a thirst for justice. Then there was the vehicle height restriction, which prohibited any vehicle taller than 6 feet from being parked on residential streets. This was a thinly veiled attempt to prevent any future fire truck thefts. The regulation was particularly burdensome for residents with SUVs and trucks, who were forced to park their vehicles in designated, oversized vehicle zones, far from their homes. But the most absurd regulation of all was the lawn ornament approval process, which required all residents to submit their lawn ornaments for approval by the HOA Architectural Review Committee. The committee, composed of Mildred McMillan and a select group of her loyal followers, had the power to reject any lawn ornament that they deemed inappropriate, offensive, or aesthetically displeasing. This was a blatant attempt to control the visual landscape of Pleasantville Estates and to prevent any further acts of suburban rebellion. The new regulations were met with widespread resentment, even among those who had initially supported the HOA's efforts to punish Karen. Many residents felt that the HOA had gone too far, that they were abusing their power, and that they were turning Pleasantville Estates into a police state. Secret acts of defiance began to proliferate. Residents planted roses in their backyards, whispered loudly after 8 p.m., and decorated their lawns with increasingly outrageous and subversive ornaments. The spirit of rebellion, ignited by Karen's actions, was alive and well in Pleasantville Estates. Even in her absence, Karen had become a symbol of freedom, a reminder that even the most oppressive regulations could be challenged, even behind bars or, perhaps, performing community service. The exact outcome of the trial remains delightfully ambiguous. Karen's influence continued to ripple through Pleasantville Estates. The seeds of rebellion she had sown were taking root, sprouting in the most unexpected places. Her own lawn, now untended and overgrown, became a potent symbol of freedom. The once perfectly manicured expanse was now a riot of wildflowers, weeds, and unruly grass. The roses, however, thrived, their vibrant colors standing out against the wild backdrop. The HOA, despite their best efforts, couldn't bring themselves to enforce the lawn maintenance ordinance on Karen's property. It had become a sacred space, a testament to her defiance. Inspired by Karen's example, other residents began to neglect their lawns, letting them grow wild and free. The HOA, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the rebellion, was forced to back down, grudgingly acknowledging the natural beauty of the overgrown lawns. Acts of minor rebellion became commonplace. Residents decorated their lawns with increasingly outrageous ornaments. Knowing that the HOA was powerless to stop them, they held clandestine water parties under the cover of darkness, laughing and splashing in defiance of the water restrictions. They whispered loudly after 8 p.m., daring the HOA patrols to intervene. In the community center, a group of residents formed a Karen Appreciation Society. Dedicated to celebrating her legacy and fighting for her release, they organized bake sales, car washes, and fundraising events to support her legal defense, or, perhaps, to help her pay her fines. Again, the details are delightfully unclear. Even Bob, the retired accountant, began to have second thoughts about his unwavering support of the HOA. He had witnessed firsthand the HOA's descent into petty tyranny, and he had come to realize that Karen, despite her flaws, had a point. He secretly started planting roses in his backyard, hiding them beneath a layer of drought-resistant succulents. The legend of Karen grew with each passing day. She became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even the most oppressive systems could be challenged, and that even the most ordinary individuals could make a difference. Her story was told and retold, embellished and exaggerated, transforming her into a mythical figure, a suburban Joan of Arc. Even in jail, or, doing community service, Karen had won. Pleasantville Estates would never be the same. The truth, as it often does, was far more complicated than anyone in Pleasantville Estates could have imagined. The fire truck incident, the water restrictions, the HOA's overreach, it was all part of a carefully orchestrated plan, masterminded by none other than Walter Perkins, a disgruntled former HOA member. Walter had been ousted from the board years ago, after a bitter dispute with Mildred McMillan over the proper shade of beige for the community center walls. He had harbored a grudge ever since, plotting his revenge against the HOA and its tyrannical regime. He had observed Karen for months, recognizing her simmering resentment and her unwavering dedication to her lawn. He saw her as the perfect pawn, a willing and enthusiastic participant in his grand scheme. He subtly manipulated her, feeding her ideas, encouraging her defiance, and providing her with the inspiration she needed to take action. It was Walter who had suggested the fire truck theft, knowing that it would be the most outrageous and attention-grabbing act of rebellion imaginable. He had even provided her with the bolt cutters and the bobby pin, knowing that she would be too impulsive to consider the consequences. He had carefully timed the water restrictions, knowing that they would push Karen over the edge. He had even leaked information to the media, ensuring that the story would receive maximum exposure, and he had orchestrated the HOA's overreaction, knowing that it would further alienate the residents and undermine the board's authority. He had secretly sabotaged the HOA office, ensuring that the water damage would be as extensive as possible. Walter had remained in the shadows throughout the entire saga, pulling the strings and watching with glee as his plan unfolded. He had used Karen as a tool, a means to an end, never revealing his true intentions. He finally revealed himself, months after Karen's trial. In a rambling, self-aggrandizing interview with a local newspaper, he confessed to his role in orchestrating the fire truck incident, claiming that he had acted out of a sense of civic duty to protect the residents of Pleasantville Estates from the tyranny of the HOA. The revelation sent shockwaves through Pleasantville Estates. Some residents were outraged, accusing Walter of manipulating Karen and exploiting her vulnerabilities. Others were secretly impressed by his cunning and his audacity, and a few even saw him as a hero, a master strategist who had outsmarted the HOA and brought them to their knees. Karen, upon learning the truth, was initially furious. She felt betrayed, used, and humiliated, but after a period of reflection, she came to realize that Walter's actions had ultimately served her purpose. She had stood up to the HOA, she had watered her roses, and she had become a symbol of freedom, regardless of Walter's motivations. In the end, Walter's plan had backfired. He had intended to undermine the HOA's authority, but he had inadvertently created a legend, a symbol of suburban rebellion that would inspire generations to come. And Karen, the unwitting pawn, had become the queen. Pleasantville Estates was forever changed. The events surrounding Karen and the fire truck had shattered the illusion of suburban perfection, exposing the underlying tensions and resentments that had always simmered beneath the surface. The HOA's power was significantly diminished. Mildred McMillan, her reputation in tatters, was eventually ousted from the board, replaced by a more moderate and reasonable leader. The new board repealed many of the most absurd regulations, ushering in a new era of relaxed enforcement and community cooperation. That a slightly more relaxed atmosphere prevailed. Residents were no longer afraid to express their individuality, to challenge authority, and to question the status quo. The community center, once a sterile and intimidating space, became a hub of social activity, a place where neighbors could gather, share ideas, and celebrate their shared humanity. Karen's lawn, now a protected historical landmark, stood as a testament to her unintended revolution. The HOA, under the terms of a court settlement, was required to maintain the lawn in its overgrown and wild state, preserving it as a symbol of freedom and defiance. The roses, however, continued to thrive, their vibrant colors a constant reminder of Karen's unwavering dedication to beauty and her willingness to fight for what she believed in. Visitors came from far and wide to admire the lawn, to pay homage to Karen, and to reflect on the meaning of suburban rebellion. Bob, the retired accountant, became a convert to the cause of freedom, planting roses in his backyard and advocating for greater community involvement. He even started a lawn liberation movement, encouraging residents to embrace the natural beauty of their yards. Walter Perkins, despite his manipulative tactics, was eventually forgiven by many residents, who recognized that he had ultimately served the community's best interests. He became a local celebrity, signing autographs and giving lectures on the art of suburban subversion. As for Karen, she returned to Pleasantville Estates a changed woman. She was no longer just a suburban housewife obsessed with her lawn. She was a symbol of hope, a champion of freedom, and a living legend. She continued to tend to her roses, but she also became involved in community affairs, advocating for greater transparency and accountability in local government. Pleasantville Estates, once a symbol of suburban conformity, had become a beacon of individuality, a place where residents were free to express themselves, to challenge authority, and to live their lives on their own terms. The Karen saga had transformed Pleasantville Estates from a meticulously regulated paradise into a vibrant and thriving community, a place where the spirit of rebellion was alive and well.